How well do we truly know the person sleeping beside us? My dears, that's a question I never thought I'd have to answer. I spent 43 years with a man I believed I knew inside and out his favorite coffee black. 2 sugars, the way he hummed while shaving, the particular creak of the floorboards when he came home late. Yet on a humid Friday evening in June 1987, I discovered that everything I thought I knew was a masterfully constructed lie. Looking back now, I realize that the people closest to us can become complete strangers overnight. We think we're paying attention, we notice when they change their cologne, when they start going to the gym, when they buy new shoes. But we miss the big things, my dears, the really big things. We miss them because we don't want to see them. We're too busy believing in the fairy tale we've built together. Little did I know, as I ironed his shirts for those weekend business trips, that I was preparing him for the most elaborate deception a spouse can orchestrate. Who would have thought that a man could live 2 complete lives under one roof? But that's exactly what Robert had been doing. My name is Patricia Eileen Hartwell, and I'm 78 years old now. This story happened in 1987, though the pain of it still visits me sometimes on quiet mornings. Before I continue, my dears, I want to thank you for clicking on this video. If you're enjoying these stories, please like this video, subscribe to the Grandma's Diary channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Your support means the world to me and to others sharing their truth. Now, let me take you back to Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a town so small that everyone knew everyone else's business, which made what happened to me all the more humiliating. I met Robert Hartwell in 1944 at a church social in Millbrook. He was a banker, respectable and handsome, with slicked back dark hair and hands that always smelled faintly of pipe. Tobacco. We married in 1950, and everyone said we were the perfect couple. I wore my mother's lace wedding dress, and the whole town came to the reception at the Millbrook Community Hall. Robert was the manager of First National Bank on Main Street. He was well respected, always in his crisp shirts and polished wingtip shoes, always with a firm handshake and a word of encouragement for the shop owners who came through his office. I was the elementary school teacher at Millbrook Primary. We were considered the golden couple, respected, stable, successful. We had 3 beautiful children. David, born in 1952. Elizabeth, born in 1954. And little Michael, born in 1960. Our house was a white colonial on Oakmont Avenue with black shutters and a wraparound porch. We hosted book club meetings there, garden parties in the spring. My hydrangeas were famous throughout the neighborhood. The azaleas bloomed pink and purple every May without fail. You know, those were the days when a woman's worth seemed measured by how perfectly she kept her home and her appearance. I baked bread twice a week, real bread from scratch, the kind that made your house smell like heaven. I pressed Robert's shirts with such care that the creases were sharp enough to cut paper. I kept our marriage as carefully as I kept my home polished, orderly, respectable. David was attending Penn State by 1980. Elizabeth was in her junior year of high school, and Michael was 13. We were family, my dears, a real family. Or so I believe. It started so subtly. In 1982, Robert began taking what he called banking conferences most weekends. Friday evenings, he'd pack a leather overnight bag, just routine meetings with regional managers. He'd tell me, kissing my forehead, very dull stuff. You wouldn't be interested. I wasn't suspicious at first. Robert had always been dedicated to his job. But looking back now, I see the signs I willfully ignored. The red flags came in small clusters at first. In the spring of 1985, I found a second pair of reading glasses in his desk drawer. Why would he need 2 pairs? Then there were the receipts from a store called Exotic Encounters in Philadelphia that I discovered in his suit pocket. When I asked him about it, he said it was a business supply store for specialty items. Nothing important, Patricia, he'd said, already reaching for the newspaper. Money started disappearing, not in large amounts, but I noticed. Robert controlled the finances, of course, as was customary then, but I helped with the household budget. In 1986, when I asked why our savings account seemed smaller than expected, he said he'd made some investments that hadn't paid off. Best not to discuss it further, he'd said firmly. I let it drop. I was taught not to question such things. There was the mysterious telephone call one Tuesday evening in January 1987. I picked up the extension by accident and heard a woman's breathy voice. Is he coming this weekend, Margaret? I never told Robert I'd heard it. Margaret? His secretary's name was Margaret. But why would she be waiting for him on weekends? His behavior became increasingly erratic. He started going to the gym, something he'd never done in 40 years. He bought new cologne, something expensive and musky that didn't smell like Robert. He became vain about his appearance, getting his hair trimmed every 2 weeks instead of monthly. He bought silk shirts. In May 1987, I found lipstick in his car, crimson red, not my shade. When I asked about it, he said Elizabeth must have left it there, but Elizabeth wore pale pink. I knew my own daughter's lipstick. The worst part, my dears, I let these things slide. I wanted to believe his explanations. I wanted to believe in the man I'd married and the life we'd built. So I pushed the doubts down deep where I couldn't examine them too closely. That was my greatest mistake, not the ignoring, but the willful blindness. On Friday, June 19th, 1987, Robert announced another weekend trip. Pittsburgh, he said. Very important meeting with the regional director. I'll be back Sunday by 6. I didn't plan to follow him. I truly didn't. But as I was putting his dinner plate away, something snapped inside me. 40 years, my dears, 40 years of unanswered questions, dismissed concerns, and carefully packaged lies. I made a decision that would change everything. I waited until he drove away in his Ford Thunderbird at 4:47 p.m. Then I got in my own car, a modest blue Chevette, and followed him. He didn't go to Pittsburgh. Instead, he drove 40 minutes east to the small town of Riverside, where he pulled into the driveway of a modest ranch house with blue shutters on Birch Street. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I watched him get out of the car, smooth his hair, and straighten his silk shirt. Then the front door opened, and I saw her, a woman in her 30s, blonde and thin, wearing one of my dresses. Not a dress like mine, one of my dresses. My green silk dress that I'd thought I'd lost 4 years ago. She was wearing my dress, and Robert was kissing her like he'd never kissed me. I sat in that car for 3 hours, my dears. 3 hours while my entire world crumbled. I watched them through the window, silhouetted against lamplight. I watched him help her with dishes. I watched him sit beside her on a sofa I didn't own, watching a television I'd never bought. At 9:45 p.m., I drove home with hands like ice. I didn't sleep that night. I went to his office on Saturday morning when I knew he was home pretending to be away. I had a key. I'd always paid the bills there. I went to his private office and found everything. The photographs were in a manila envelope in his desk drawer. Photographs of Robert with this woman named Francine Mallory, who was, I would later discover, a stenographer from the bank's Philadelphia branch. But that wasn't the worst of it. The documents showed that Robert had taken a loan out against our house in 1984. Not one loan, 3. He'd been draining our savings, our equity, everything we'd built. There were hotel receipts from Atlantic City. There were bills for jewelry I'd never seen, clothes I'd never worn, a second mortgage I'd never known existed. And then I found the letters, handwritten letters in a feminine script. Darling Robert, they began, when will you finally leave that boring woman? You promised by Christmas. That letter was dated December 1986. This letter, from March 1987. I'm pregnant, Robert. We need to talk about what comes next. I stood in that office, holding those letters in trembling hands, and I understood the full scope of his betrayal. It wasn't just infidelity. It was financial devastation. It was a secret child. It was the systematic dismantling of everything I thought we had. But there was more. I called First National Bank on Monday morning and asked to speak with the regional director. "I'm Robert Hartwell's wife," I said, my voice steady even though I felt like I was shattering. "I need to know about a loan he made last month." The director's tone changed. "Mrs. Hartwell, I think your husband needs to explain some irregularities in his account management." I hung up before he could continue. I already knew Robert had been embezzling, small amounts at first, then larger amounts. He'd been covering his tracks with creative accounting, but he'd made mistakes, sloppy mistakes. The bank was about to audit. Robert came home on Sunday, June 21st at 6:15 p.m., exactly as he'd promised. He walked through our front door humming, loosening his tie, completely unaware that his entire life had been exposed. I was sitting in the living room with all the evidence spread on the coffee table, like a prosecutor's exhibit. The photographs, the letters, the bank documents, the receipts for a jewelry store engagement ring from December 1986. His face went white, actually white. My dears, I remember thinking it looked like all the blood had drained into his shoes. "Patricia, I can explain, don't," I said. My voice was calm. That scared him more than anger would have. "Pack a bag." He tried to negotiate. He tried to tell me about how unhappy he'd been, about how he felt unappreciated, about how Francine understood him in ways I never could. He tried to make it my fault. "You were always so focused on perfection, on appearances. You never asked me what I wanted. You never really saw me. I'd prepared for this moment, even though I didn't know I was preparing." "You're right," I said coldly. "I didn't see you, because the man I thought I'd married didn't exist." By Tuesday, I had called a Laura Margaret Finley, a woman I barely knew who worked at a law firm in the city. I hired her for a retainer I couldn't afford, but had to scrape together anyway. By Wednesday, Robert had been arrested by federal agents for embezzlement. The amount was $67,000, a fortune in 1987. 23 years of deposited money in an account under the name R.M. Sterling. The scandal destroyed Millbrook. Or rather, Millbrook destroyed me with the scandal as ammunition. First, the ladies from church, the very women I'd served with on committees, whose babies I'd taught in my classroom, stopped speaking to me. At the grocery store, they'd turn away. At the post office, conversations would halt. I overheard Mrs. Eleanor Cross, the mayor's wife, telling someone that I was obviously a neglectful wife, that no man commits adultery if his home is happy. The implication was clear. This was my fault. My failure as a wife and woman had driven my husband into another woman's arms. The school board didn't fire me, but they made my position redundant. We have to be careful about the image we present. the superintendent said kindly, like he was doing me a favor. Then came the financial ruin. Not only was our house in jeopardy because of the mortgages Robert had taken out, but his lawyer, a snake of a man named Harrison Pierce, argued that our assets should be frozen, pending the investigation. Our bank accounts were already frozen. We had perhaps $3,000 in cash and 3 growing children. I was 43 years old, and I had nothing. David was away at college and managed to continue his studies only because his professors helped arrange a work-study position. Elizabeth, who'd been popular, kind, and beloved, became the banker's daughter. The girl at school who couldn't hold her head up. She dropped out of 2 clubs. Michael simply shut down. He was 13, my dears, and his father was in federal prison awaiting trial, and his mother was a spectacle. I learned about desperation in the summer of 1987. Real desperation, not the melodramatic kind. I learned what it felt like to count quarters to buy milk. I learned what exhaustion meant when you had no one to share the burden. The first thing I did was rent out 2 bedrooms to lodgers. I placed an advertisement in the local paper, clean rooms, reasonable rates. The first people to respond were 2 nursing school students, and later, an elderly man named Mr. Chen, who'd recently lost his wife. Renting those rooms gave me $400 a month. It was enough for utilities and food if we were careful. My hands became instruments of survival. I washed laundry for other families' clothes I'd have once considered too intimate to handle. I'd wake at 5 a.m. and spend 2 hours before school washing and pressing other people's garments. The soap was a harsh industrial brand called Felsnaptha that cracked my hands raw. My fingernails became brittle and weak. I used hand cream that smelled like glycerin and lye, but nothing seemed to heal the splits and cracks that formed along my knuckles. By autumn, my hands didn't feel like mine anymore. They felt like the hands of someone from another era, someone from a Victorian novel roughened and aged by necessity. In the evenings, I started baking. I'd always loved to bake. It had been my pleasure, my art form. Now it became my business. I made pound cakes, fruit tarts, cream pies. I'd started with just the ladies from church, who bought them out of pity. But word spread about Mrs. Hartwell's cakes, and soon I was taking orders from the bakery in town and from families for birthdays and celebrations. I named my small business Patricia's Provisions. My kitchen became a factory. Standing at the counter for hours, my feet aching in shoes I couldn't replace, stirring batters by hand because we couldn't afford an electric mixer. The scent of butter and vanilla that I'd once associated with comfort became the scent of desperation. But gradually, those cakes earned me $250 a week. In 1988, That was real money that I started tutoring too. After school hours, I'd work with children who were struggling with their studies, reading, mathematics, writing. I did it out of my home because I couldn't afford to go anywhere else. The pay was modest $15 per hour, but with 3 students, that was another $45 a week. Elizabeth learned to sew, and we started mending clothes for people. Michael took a job at the hardware store, working Saturday mornings for $4.50 an hour. Every penny went into a jar on the kitchen counter labeled college fund. I cleaned houses. Not like hiring a cleaning service. I went into people's homes and scrubbed their toilets and mopped their floors. Once, I was cleaning the house of Mrs. Eleanor Cross, the same woman who'd spread vicious rumors about me. I was on my knees, scrubbing her grout, when she came downstairs. She looked at me with such pity that I wanted to cry. But I didn't. I just kept scrubbing. The hardest part wasn't the physical exhaustion, though that was real. By 1989, I was working 5 jobs simultaneously. I was teaching part-time at the school 3 days a week. They'd rehired me in a limited capacity. Washing clothes, baking, tutoring, and cleaning houses. I averaged 4 hours of sleep. I lost 35 pounds because I forgot to eat. But the hardest part was the shame. The shame of being visible, of neighbors knowing that I was struggling, of having my poverty on display as I walked to my cleaning jobs, carrying my supplies in a plastic bucket, of my children knowing that their mother was scrubbing other people's homes. There was a night in November 1988 when I came home after cleaning Mrs. Cross's house, and Michael found me crying in the garage. I was trying to hide it. I never wanted the children to see me break. But he found me anyway. Mom, his voice was so small. I held him, and he was nearly as tall as me already. And I thought, I have failed this boy. I've let him see the complete disintegration of the life I promised him. But Michael surprised me. I got promoted at the hardware store. He said, I'm going to be the assistant manager next year. It's part-time now, but I can increase my hours next summer. That's when I understood something crucial. My dears, our children don't need perfect parents. They need resilient parents. They need to see that falling apart doesn't mean staying broken. The turning point came from an unexpected place. In March 1990, there was a town festival, the annual Millbrook Spring Fair. I'd been asked by the organizers to provide baked goods for the church booth, the same church that had abandoned me. I almost refused, but Elizabeth encouraged me. Mom, let them taste your cakes, she'd said. Stop hiding. So I baked 6 cakes and delivered them to the church booth. I didn't stay. I couldn't bear to watch people judge me, but I came back at the end of the day to collect my payment. What I found was remarkable. All 6 cakes were sold. But more than that, there was a line of people who'd asked about me specifically, who wanted to know if I took larger orders, who asked if I'd consider supplying cakes regularly to the local restaurants. And then Margaret Finley appeared, my dears, the lawyer who'd represented me during the divorce. She was 83 years old, a widow, and she'd come to the fair specifically to find me. Patricia, she said, taking my hand, I've been wanting to talk to you. I eat your cakes at the bakery regularly. They're exceptional. You're wasting your talent. She took me to lunch at Miller's Diner and suggested something radical, that I start a legitimate baking business, not just side work, but a real business. She offered to help me with the paperwork and even spoke to the bank about a small business loan. But the real magic happened 3 days later at the post office. I was mailing envelopes. I decided to take Margaret's advice seriously when old Mr. Whitmore came in. Mr. Whitmore was 91 years old and had been a founding member of Millbrook. He was respected in a way that transcended gossip. He saw me and walked directly over. The post office went quiet. Everyone was watching. Patricia, he said loudly, I wanted to tell you something. My granddaughter came home from college last month raving about your cakes. Said she'd ordered one for her roommate's birthday. I've also heard that you've been supporting your family entirely on your own for 3 years, that you teach school, bake, tutor, and clean houses. I want you to know that I think you're the strongest woman in this town. He paused, and then he said something that changed everything. I also want you to know that I think Robert is a coward, always have. A man who would do what he did, who would steal from his bank and his wife. That's not a reflection on you. That's a reflection on him. He walked out. The post office erupted in whispered conversation behind me. Within 2 weeks, 5 women who'd previously shunned me came to my door asking if I'd cater their events. One of them was Mrs. Eleanor Cross herself, with Margaret's help and a small business loan for $5. I officially launched Patricia's Provisions in 1991. I rented a small commercial kitchen from a local restaurant on off hours and began wholesale baking. By 1992, I had contracts with 3 restaurants and a catering company. By 1994, I had 10 employees, mostly women like me, trying to rebuild their lives, and we'd moved into a proper commercial kitchen space. The business was making enough money that I could finally focus exclusively on it and leave my cleaning and tutoring jobs behind. David graduated from Penn State in 1992 with a degree in biology. He went on to medical school and became a pediatrician. Elizabeth graduated high school in 1988 and went to community college, then transferred to a 4-year university where she earned a degree in education. She's been a high school English teacher for 30 years now. Michael graduated in 1991 and attended the state university on a partial scholarship and loans, earning his degree in accounting. He now runs his own accounting firm. My grandchildren started arriving in 1995. 7 beautiful grandchildren by the year 2000. I held each of them in my arms, and I wept because I knew that my struggle had bought them a better future. Their father had a father who was a criminal and an adulterer, but they also had a grandmother who didn't let that define them. Patricia's provisions grew beyond my wildest dreams. By 1998, we'd won Best Bakery in the county 3 years running. I was featured in the Pennsylvania Business Journal. Local restaurants featured my cakes on special occasions. What started as desperation became pride. In 2002. I sold the business for enough money to pay off every debt I'd accumulated and to set up college funds for my grandchildren. I retired at 64, financially secure. The people who gossiped about me started speaking differently. Mrs. Eleanor Cross even apologized, though I'm not sure she meant it sincerely. It didn't matter. I'd already forgiven her, not for her sake, but for mine. Robert died in 2009. I heard through the grapevine that he'd never recovered from his fall from grace. He'd had a second marriage that didn't work out. He worked odd jobs and lived alone in an apartment in Atlantic City. Francine had left him while he was in prison. His secret second child was never acknowledged. At his funeral, which I didn't attend, there were fewer than 20 people. Looking back now from the vantage point of 78 years, I understand something fundamental about hardship. My dears, we are so much stronger than we know. We are capable of enduring things we never thought we could survive. And often, the greatest gifts come from the greatest betrayals. If Robert hadn't been unfaithful, if he hadn't embezzled, if my entire world hadn't collapsed, I would have lived a comfortable, respectable, utterly ordinary life. I would have stayed a banker's wife and a school teacher. But instead, I became an entrepreneur, a survivor, a woman who built something real with her own 2 hands. You know what my hands taught me? That breaking isn't the same as being broken. That work, real work, has dignity. That your children will remember not the perfect moments you created, but the moments they watched you refuse to surrender. My dears, if you're going through your own betrayal, whether it's infidelity or financial ruin or public humiliation, I want you to know that you will survive this. You will do more than survive. You'll build something new. You'll discover strength you didn't know you possessed. And someday, you'll look back and realize that the worst day of your life became the first day of your real life. Thank you for listening to me today. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the Grandma's Diary channel. so you don't miss our next stories. Share with someone who might be needing a little hope. Where are you watching from? Leave it in the comments. I read every single one, and your stories matter to me too.